I thought by leaving I could prevent it all. Olivia reached out, taking her husband's hand. But don't you see? By trying to prevent that future, you nearly ensured it happened. It was only by coming back, by facing your fears, that we found a way forward. The truth of her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the journey they'd all taken. Sarah, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. So what do we do now? Do we use the clock to guide every decision for the Posada? Daniel shook his head. No, that's not the point. The clock isn't meant to make our decisions for us. It's a tool to help us understand the power of our choices, to remind us of the importance of acting with love and purpose. Michael nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. It's about being mindful, isn't it? About recognizing that every interaction, every moment has the potential to shape our future. Exactly, Daniel agreed, and about understanding that the most important factor in shaping a positive future is the love and connection we share as a family. As they stood there, surrounded by the gentle ticking of the clock and the hum of possibility, a sense of peace settled over the Carter family. They had faced their past, confronted their fears, and found a way to move forward together. In the weeks that followed, Taste of Home officially reopened its doors. The Posada quickly became a favorite among locals and tourists alike, known for its warm atmosphere, delicious food, and the palpable sense of love that seemed to permeate every corner. Daniel returned to the kitchen, his passion for cooking reignited. But now, he shared that passion with his family. Michael stood beside him, learning the secrets of his father's famous recipes. Sarah managed the business with a newfound confidence, her innovative ideas bringing fresh energy to the Posada. Olivia, fully recovered and more vibrant than ever, became the heart of Taste of Home. Her stories and warm welcome made every guest feel like part of the family. And Emily, wise beyond her years, became the unofficial keeper of the clock's secret. She understood in a way that sometimes surpassed even the adults, the delicate balance between embracing the future and living fully in the present. One evening, as the sun set over Milwaukee, casting a warm glow through the Posada's windows, the Carter family gathered for dinner. The dining room was filled with the aroma of Daniel's cooking and the sound of laughter. As Daniel looked around the table, seeing the joy on the faces of his loved ones, he realized that this moment of togetherness, of love and forgiveness, was the future he had always hoped for, but had been too afraid to embrace. Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To family, she said, her voice full of emotion. To second chances and new beginnings. To the power of choice, Michael added, a smile playing on his lips. To love, Olivia said softly, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the table. To the magic of time, Emily chimed in, her young face alight with understanding beyond her years. Daniel felt his heart swell with gratitude and love. To all of that, he said, raising his own glass, and to the incredible journey that brought us here. As their glasses clinked together, the old pendulum clock in the room upstairs ticked steadily on, its face glowing softly with the infinite possibilities of the future. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family and the promise of tomorrow, the Carters knew that they had already found their happiest timeline. Our girl sits next to a man on a train. What she reveals on the journey left him in shock. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video. Give it a like. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Comment and share. The gentle rumble of the train's wheels against the tracks filled the air as Emily Thompson, a bright-eyed 11-year-old with a mop of curly brown hair, settled into her seat. She clutched her backpack tightly, her heart racing with excitement and nervousness. This was her first solo trip from Chicago to Milwaukee, and she couldn't help but feel like a grown-up on a big adventure. As the train lurched forward, Emily glanced around the car, taking in the mix of commuters and travelers. Her gaze settled on the empty seat beside her, wondering who might join her on this journey. Just as the thought crossed her mind, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes approached. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Emily shook her head, scooting closer to the window to make room. The man sat down with a weary sigh, placing a worn duffel bag at his feet. Emily couldn't help but notice the man's calloused hands and the faint smell of spices that clung to his clothes. As the train picked up speed, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She had always been told not to talk to strangers, but something about this man seemed familiar. She rummaged through her backpack, pulling out a small photo album. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you Daniel Carter?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" Emily held up an old photograph, yellowed with age. In it, a younger version of the man beside her stood proudly in front of a quaint restaurant, his arm around a smiling woman. "This is you, isn't it? You're my grandpa." Daniel's face paled, his hands trembling slightly as he took the photo from Emily. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "My grandma Olivia keeps it in her bedroom," Emily replied, watching Daniel's reaction carefully. "She told me stories about you, about how you used to be a famous chef in Chicago, but then you disappeared 15 years ago. Nobody knew where you went." Daniel stared at the photo, lost in memories. The bustling train car seemed to fade away, as he was transported back to a time when life was full of promise and success. He could almost smell the aromas from his kitchen, hear the laughter of patrons in his restaurant. I don't know what to say," Daniel finally managed, handing the photo back to Emily. "You're right, that is me, but I'm not that man anymore. I haven't been for a long time." Emily's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What happened? Why did you leave? Grandma Olivia never told me the whole story. She just gets sad whenever I ask." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's complicated, kiddo. Sometimes adults make mistakes, big ones that they can't take back. I made a choice that hurt a lot of people, including your grandmother and your mother. It was easier to disappear than face what I'd done." Emily listened intently, her young mind trying to piece together this family mystery. "But don't you miss them? Don't you want to see them again?" Before Daniel could answer, the train conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the next station. Daniel seemed relieved at the interruption, using it as an opportunity to change the subject. "So, what brings a young girl like you on this train all by yourself?" he asked, his tone lighter. Emily's face fell slightly. "I'm going to visit Grandma Olivia. She's in the hospital in Milwaukee. Mom couldn't get time off work to come with me, so she put me on the train. Uncle Michael is supposed to pick me up at the station." Daniel's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is Olivia okay?" Emily shrugged. "The doctors say she's stable, but she's been asking to see the whole family. That's why I'm going. Mom and Uncle Michael are coming tomorrow." As the train continued its journey, Emily and Daniel fell into an uneasy conversation. She told him about her school, her friends, and her dreams of becoming a chef, just like he used to be. Daniel listened, a mix of emotions playing across his face: pride, regret, and a deep sadness that he couldn't quite hide. As they neared Milwaukee, Emily made a bold decision. "You should come with me," she said suddenly, "to see Grandma Olivia. I think it would make her really happy." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. I don't think that's a good idea, Emily. It's been too long. They wouldn't want to see me." "But Grandma's been asking for the whole family," Emily persisted. "That includes you. Please, Grandpa Daniel, at least think about it." The train began to slow as it approached Milwaukee Station. Daniel stood up, grabbing his duffel bag. "I'm sorry, Emily, I can't. It's better this way. Take care of your grandmother, okay?" As Daniel turned to leave, Emily called out, "Wait, the old Pusada, Taste of Home. It's still there. If you change your mind, that's where we'll be." Daniel paused for a moment, then nodded without turning back. He disappeared into the crowd of disembarking passengers, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and the weight of a family secret. As Emily stepped off the train, she spotted her Uncle Michael waiting on the platform. He was a tall man with kind eyes, looking anxious as he scanned the crowd. When he saw Emily, relief washed over his face. "There you are, Pumpkin," he called out, wrapping her in a tight hug. "How was the trip? No trouble, I hope?" Emily hesitated, unsure of whether to mention her encounter with Daniel. "It was interesting," she said finally. "Uncle Michael, can we go see Grandma right away?" Michael nodded, taking Emily's backpack. "Of course. She's been asking for you all day. Let's not keep her waiting. As they drove through the familiar streets of Milwaukee, Emily's mind raced. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, wondering if he would find the courage to come to the Posada. The old family business, Taste of Home, had been converted into a small inn years ago, but it still held so many memories and secrets. When they arrived at the hospital, Emily's heart sank at the sight of her grandmother. Olivia Carter lay in the hospital bed, looking frail and tired, but her face lit up when she saw her granddaughter. "Emily, my dear," Olivia exclaimed, reaching out her arms. "Come here and give your old grandma a hug." Emily rushed to embrace her, careful not to disturb the various tubes and wires connected to Olivia. "I missed you, Grandma," she whispered. As they settled in for a visit, Emily couldn't help but notice the old pendulum clock ticking away on the bedside table. It was a family heirloom, one that usually hung in the Posada's lobby. Its presence here seemed significant, though Emily couldn't quite understand why. "Grandma," Emily began hesitantly, "I have something to tell you. Something important happened on the train." But before she could continue, the door opened, and Sarah, Emily's mother, burst into the room. "Mom, I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow," Emily exclaimed, surprised. Sarah looked flustered, her eyes darting around the room. I got an earlier flight. Emily, sweetie, we need to talk. Something's happened." The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew tense. Michael stood up, concern etched on his face. "Sarah, what's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. It's about Dad. He's been seen in Milwaukee." The room fell silent, save for the steady ticking of the old clock. Olivia's face paled, her grip tightening on Emily's hand. Michael's expression hardened, a mix of anger and disbelief in his eyes. Emily's heart raced. She knew she should speak up, tell them about her encounter on the train, but the words caught in her throat. The family secret she had stumbled upon suddenly felt too big, too overwhelming. As the adults began to talk in hushed, urgent tones, Emily's gaze was drawn back to the old clock. Its steady rhythm seemed to echo the beating of her heart, each tick bringing them closer to a confrontation 15 years in the making. Little did they know, just a few blocks away, Daniel Carter stood outside the old Taste of Home Posada, his hand hesitating on the doorknob, caught between the past he'd run from and the future he never thought he'd have. The stage was set for a family reunion that would unearth long-buried secrets and test the bonds of love and forgiveness. As the clock continued its relentless march forward, Emily realized that her simple train ride had set in motion events that would change her family forever. The old Posada stood silent in the fading light of day, its weathered sign creaking gently in the breeze. Daniel Carter's hand trembled as he finally turned the doorknob, stepping into a past he had long since abandoned. The lobby's familiar scent, a mix of old wood, fresh linen, and lingering spices, hit him like a tidal wave of memories. His eyes were immediately drawn to the empty spot on the wall where the pendulum clock once hung. Its absence felt like a physical ache, a reminder of all he had lost. As Daniel moved further into the lobby, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, he was struck by how little had changed. The same worn carpet, the same creaky floorboards. It was as if time had stood still within these walls. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the tension in Olivia's room was palpable. Sarah paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "I can't believe he has the nerve to show up now after all these years," she fumed. Michael leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Are we sure it's really him? It could be a mistake." Emily sat quietly by her grandmother's bedside, the weight of her secret growing heavier by the minute. She watched as Olivia's gaze repeatedly drifted to the old clock on the nightstand, a sadness in her eyes that Emily had never noticed before. "Emily," Olivia said softly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told all of you a long time ago." Sarah and Michael fell silent, turning to face their mother. Emily leaned in closer, her heart racing with anticipation. Olivia took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on the clock's face. "This clock, it's more than just a family heirloom. It holds a secret, one that your grandfather and I have kept for decades." As Olivia began her tale, the scene shifted back to the Posada. Daniel had made his way to the old kitchen, his sanctuary for so many years. He ran his hand along the stainless steel countertops, remembering the countless meals prepared, the laughter shared, the dreams that once seemed so attainable. In a small drawer beneath the main prep station, Daniel found what he was looking for, an old, tarnished key. He held it up to the light, memories flooding back of the day he had hidden it away, vowing never to return. Back at the hospital, Olivia's story unfolded. "Your grandfather wasn't just a chef," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He was also an inventor. That clock in our lobby wasn't just for telling time. It was Daniel's greatest creation, a device that could—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the weight of her words. Sarah and Michael exchanged confused glances, while Emily leaned forward, hanging on every word. "A device that could what, Grandma?" Emily prompted gently. Olivia sighed. "It sounds crazy, I know, but that clock, it could predict the future, not in a grand, world-changing way, but in small personal ways. It showed glimpses of what was to come for our family, our business." The room fell silent as the implications of Olivia's words sank in. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice laced with disbelief. "Mum, that's impossible. You can't be serious." "I know how it sounds," Olivia replied, her eyes pleading for understanding. "But it's the truth. Your father spent years perfecting it, using his knowledge of physics and his intuition as a chef. He believed that time was like a recipe. If you knew the ingredients and how they interacted, you could peek at the final dish before it was done." As Olivia continued her explanation, Daniel was making his way up the stairs of the Posada, the old key clutched tightly in his hand. He paused outside a door at the end of the hallway, taking a deep breath before inserting the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty room filled with papers, diagrams, and strange mechanical parts. In the center stood a workbench, and on it, covered by a sheet, was the shape of something that looked remarkably like the clock from the lobby. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the sheet, hesitating for a moment before pulling it away. There, in all its intricate glory, sat an exact replica of the pendulum clock, or perhaps the original. As Daniel stared at the clock, his mind raced back to the day everything had fallen apart. The day he had seen something in the clock that had shaken him to his core, something that had made him run away from everything and everyone he loved. In the hospital room, Olivia was reaching the crux of her story. The clock showed Daniel something 15 years ago, something that terrified him. He never told me what it was, but the next day, he was gone. He left behind a note saying it was for our own good that he was protecting us. Sarah sank into a chair, her anger giving way to confusion and hurt. But why? What could have been so terrible that he'd abandon his family, his whole life? Michael, who had been quiet throughout Olivia's revelation, finally spoke up. "Does this have something to do with the financial troubles the Posada was having back then? I remember overhearing you and Dad arguing about money just before he left." Olivia nodded slowly. "We were struggling, it's true, but it was more than that. Whatever Daniel saw in that clock, it was personal. It was about our family." As the family grappled with this shocking revelation, Emily's mind was racing. She thought about her encounter with Daniel on the train, about the sadness and fear she had seen in his eyes. Suddenly she stood up. "I have to go," she announced, her voice filled with determination. Sarah looked at her daughter in surprise. "Go where?" "Emily, what are you talking about?" "To the Posada," Emily replied, already moving towards the door. I think Grandpa Daniel might be there." Before anyone could stop her, Emily darted out of the room. Sarah called after her, but Michael put a hand on his sister's arm. "Let her go," he said softly. "I think it's time we all face this, whatever it is." As Emily raced through the hospital corridors and out into the street, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement, Daniel stood in the hidden room of the Posada, his hand hovering over the clock's face. With trembling fingers, he opened the clock's glass door and reached inside, adjusting a series of small gears and levers. The clock's pendulum began to swing, faster and faster, its ticking growing louder until it filled the room. Suddenly, the clock's face began to glow, and images started to form in its depths. Daniel leaned in, his breath catching in his throat as he saw flashes of the future, his family's future. As the images swirled and shifted, Daniel's eyes widened in shock. What he saw was nothing like the terrible vision that had driven him away 15 years ago. Instead, he saw... The sound of the Posada's front door slamming shut snapped Daniel out of his trance. He heard quick footsteps on the stairs, coming closer and closer. "Grandpa Daniel?" Emily's voice called out, echoing through the old building. "Are you here?" Daniel stood frozen, caught between the revelations of the clock and the reality of his granddaughter's presence. As Emily's footsteps drew nearer, he realized that the moment he had been running from for 15 years had finally arrived. The door to the hidden room slowly creaked open, and there stood Emily, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. The strange contraptions, the papers strewn about, and in the center of it all, her long-lost grandfather standing next to the glowing, ticking clock. "Grandpa," Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe and a hint of fear. "What is all this?" Daniel looked from Emily to the clock and back again, knowing that the time for secrets was finally over. With a deep breath, he began to speak, ready at last to reveal the truth that had torn their family apart, and might now be the key to bringing them back together. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the small room, filling the space between Emily and Daniel with its rhythmic pulse. Daniel's shoulders sagged as if the weight of 15 years of secrets was finally becoming too much to bear. "Emily," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I never thought I'd have to explain this to anyone, least of all my own granddaughter." He gestured to the glowing clock. "This machine, it's both a miracle and a curse." Emily stepped closer, her eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. "Is it true what Grandma Olivia said? Can it really show the future?" Daniel nodded slowly. "In a way, yes, but it's not as simple as that. It doesn't show a clear picture, more like possibilities, fragments of what might be." He ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression troubled. 15 years ago, I saw something in this clock that terrified me. Something I thought I had to prevent at all costs." As Daniel spoke, the scene at the hospital was growing tense. Sarah paced the room, her worry for Emily evident in every step. "We have to go after her," she insisted, reaching for her purse. Michael placed a calming hand on his sister's arm. "Sarah, wait. Maybe this is what needs to happen. We've been running from this for 15 years. It's time we faced it." Olivia watched her children from her hospital bed, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Michael's right, Sarah. It's time for the truth to come out. All of it." Sarah hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect her daughter and the need for answers that had plagued her for so long. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but we're going together as a family." Back at the Posada, Emily was trying to make sense of her grandfather's words. "What did you see, Grandpa? What was so terrible that you had to leave us?" Daniel's eyes misted over as he recalled that fateful day. "I saw our family torn apart, Emily. I saw financial ruin, betrayal, and..." He paused, his voice breaking. "And death. I thought if I left, if I removed myself from the equation, I could prevent it all from happening." Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. "But Grandpa, how could leaving prevent any of that? Didn't it just make things worse?" Daniel smiled sadly. "You're a smart girl, Emily. You're right, of course. I realized too late that running away wasn't the answer. But by then I was too ashamed to come back, too afraid to face what I'd done." As they talked, the clock's glow intensified, drawing both their attentions. Images began to swirl on its face. Fleeting glimpses of familiar faces, places, and events yet to come. "Look," Daniel said, pointing to the clock. "It's showing us something now." Emily leaned in, her eyes wide with wonder. In the clock's face, she saw flashes of her family, her mother's tears turning to smiles, her uncle's furrowed brow softening, her grandmother's health improving. And weaving through it all was the image of Daniel, no longer absent but an integral part of their lives. "I don't understand," Emily whispered. "It all looks good, happy. Why were you so afraid before?" Daniel shook his head, bewildered. "I don't know. It's nothing like what I saw 15 years ago. It's as if..." His words were cut off by the sound of the Posada's front door opening. Footsteps echoed through the old building, accompanied by familiar voices calling out, "Emily? Daniel?" It was Sarah's voice, tinged with worry and something else, hope perhaps. Emily looked at her grandfather, seeing the panic in his eyes. "It's okay," she said, taking his hand. "We have to face them together, like the clock showed us." Meanwhile, Sarah, Michael and Olivia, who had insisted on leaving the hospital against medical advice, made their way through the Posada. The sight of the old family business brought back a flood of memories, some bitter, some sweet. As they climbed the stairs, following the sound of voices, tension hung heavy in the air. None of them knew quite what to expect when they reached the top. When they finally entered the small room, the scene that greeted them was unlike anything they could have imagined. Daniel stood next to a glowing, ticking clock, his hand clasped tightly in Emily's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's eyes locked with Daniel's, years of hurt and confusion passing between them in an instant. Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion, and Olivia, leaning heavily on her cane, looked at her long-lost husband with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Dad?" Sarah breathed, breaking the silence. "Is it really you?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Emily squeezed his hand encouragingly. "What is all this?" Michael demanded, gesturing to the room full of strange contraptions. "What have you been doing all these years while we thought you were dead?" Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I owe you all an explanation, a big one. But first, there's something you need to see." He turned to the clock, adjusting a few dials. The room filled with a soft, pulsing light as images began to form on the clock's face. "My God," Olivia whispered, recognizing the device for what it was. "You finished it." The family gathered around, watching in awe as scenes from their possible future played out before them. They saw moments of joy, of reconciliation, of success and love. But they also glimpsed challenges, arguments and obstacles to overcome. As the images faded, Daniel turned to face his family. "This is what I've been working on, what I've been running from. I thought I could protect you all by staying away, but I was wrong. I see that now." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. "Why, Dad, why did you leave us?" Daniel's shoulders slumped. 15 years ago I saw a future that terrified me, our family torn apart, the business in ruins, and—" He hesitated, looking at Olivia. "And you, my love, I saw you dying. I thought if I left, I could change that future. I thought I was saving you all." Michael scoffed, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Save us? Do you have any idea what we've been through? The pain, the struggling, the endless questions?" "I know," Daniel said, his voice heavy with regret. "I know now that I made a terrible mistake. I let my fear control me, and I hurt the people I love most in the world." As the family grappled with Daniel's revelation, Emily spoke up. "But look at what the clock shows now," she said, pointing to the fading images. "It's different. We can still have a good future, all of us together." Olivia stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "The future isn't set in stone, is it, my dear? It's what we make of it." Daniel nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "That's what I've learned after all these years. The clock doesn't show us an inevitable future. It shows us possibilities, ones we can shape with our choices." Sarah, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "So what now? We can't just pretend the last 15 years didn't happen." "No, we can't," Daniel agreed. "But maybe we can start to heal, to build something new." As the family stood in that small room, surrounded by the physical manifestation of time's mysteries, they faced a choice. Could they forgive the past? Could they embrace the possibility of a future together? The old clock ticked steadily, a reminder that time marches on, carrying with it the potential for both sorrow and joy. As they looked at each other, parents, children, grandchild, the first tentative steps toward reconciliation began to form. Outside the Posada, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Inside, a family stood on the brink of a new chapter, their story far from over but filled with newfound hope. Emily, wise beyond her years, looked at the adults around her. "The clock shows us what could be," she said softly. But it's up to us to make it happen." As her words sank in, a tentative smile appeared on Sarah's face. Michael's stance relaxed slightly. Olivia reached out, taking Daniel's free hand in hers. The journey ahead would not be easy. There were wounds to heal, trusts to rebuild, and a future to shape. But as they stood together in that room, with the magical clock as their witness, the Carter family took their first step toward a future they would create together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for the Carter family. They had moved their base of operations back to the old Posada, Taste of Home, which now served as both a reunion spot and a place of healing. The familiar surroundings, filled with memories both bitter and sweet, provided a fitting backdrop for their attempts at reconciliation. Daniel had taken up residence in his old room, the space now feeling both familiar and foreign to him. Each morning, he would wake up early, his chef's instincts still ingrained after all these years, and make his way to the kitchen. The act of preparing breakfast for his family became a small gesture of atonement, a way to show his love and commitment to rebuilding what he had broken. On this particular morning, as Daniel stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Sarah standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. "You're up early," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice light despite the tension that still lingered between them. Sarah nodded, moving further into the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep, the smell of coffee lured me down." She paused, watching her father work. "You still make them the same way? The pancakes, I mean." Daniel smiled softly. "Some things you never forget." As Sarah sat at the kitchen island, Daniel placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the sizzle of batter on the griddle. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told us, about the clock, about why you left." She took a deep breath. "I'm trying to understand. I really am. But there's still so much anger, so much hurt." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I know, sweetheart, and you have every right to feel that way. What I did, it's not something that can be fixed overnight." Sarah's fingers tightened around her mug. "Do you know what it was like? Growing up without a father, watching Mom struggle to keep the Posada afloat, always wondering if you were dead or alive." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I can only imagine the pain I caused. If I could go back and change things, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is try to make amends, to be here for you all now." As they talked, Michael entered the kitchen, his presence adding another layer of complexity to the conversation. He nodded curtly to Daniel before pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Smells good," he commented, his tone neutral. "Just like old times, huh?" The three of them settled into an uneasy silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. It was clear that while they were all under one roof, the road to true reconciliation would be long and challenging. Meanwhile, upstairs, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, her young mind trying to process everything that had happened. She pulled out her journal, a gift from her grandmother, and began to write. "Dear Diary," she penned. "Everything's different now. Grandpa Daniel is back, and it's like a storm has hit our family. Mom is sad and angry, Uncle Michael barely talks, and Grandma Olivia tries to keep everyone calm. And then there's the clock. It's amazing and scary at the same time. I wonder what would happen if we could all see our futures. Would it make things better or worse?" As Emily wrote, she heard a soft knock at her door. It was Olivia, looking tired, but wearing a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," Olivia said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you holding up with all of this?" Emily shrugged. "I'm okay, I guess. It's just complicated. I'm happy Grandpa Daniel is back, but everyone seems so sad and angry." Olivia nodded understandingly. "It is complicated, dear. Sometimes, when people we love hurt us, it takes time to heal. But I believe we can get through this as a family." As they talked, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. "Grandma, can you tell me more about the clock? How does it really work?" Olivia's eyes took on a faraway look. "Oh, Emily, that clock has been a part of our family's story for so long. Your grandfather spent years working on it, combining his knowledge of physics with, well, something a little more mysterious. She leaned in as if sharing a secret. You see, Daniel always believed that cooking was a kind of magic, the way ingredients came together to create something new and wonderful. He thought time worked the same way, that if you understood its ingredients, you could peek at what was cooking in the future. Emily's eyes widened. But how? It's not really magic, is it? Olivia chuckled. No, not magic in the fairy tale sense, but science so advanced it might seem like magic to most people. Daniel used principles of quantum mechanics, theories about parallel universes, and yes, a bit of that special intuition that made him such a brilliant chef. As Olivia explained, Emily found herself drawn into the story, imagining her grandfather as a mix of scientist and wizard, stirring the pot of time itself. Downstairs, the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted. As Daniel, Sarah, and Michael ate breakfast together, the conversation slowly began to flow more freely. They reminisced about old times, sharing memories of holidays at the Posada, of Daniel's famous recipes, of simpler days before everything fell apart. Remember that Thanksgiving when the oven broke down, Sarah said, a small smile playing on her lips. Dad, you somehow managed to cook an entire feast using just the stovetop and the outdoor grill. Daniel laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. I'd almost forgotten about that. Your mother thought I was crazy, but we pulled it off. Michael, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. I've been thinking about the Posada, about reopening it properly. Sarah and Daniel looked at him in surprise. Really? Sarah asked. But your job in Chicago? Michael shrugged. I've been feeling unfulfilled there for a while now. Maybe it's time to come back to our roots, if we're really doing this. Being a family again. The words hung in the air, full of hope and uncertainty. Daniel looked at his son, seeing the boy he'd left behind in the man before him. I'd like that, Michael. If you'll have me, I'd like to help, to teach you what I know. As they discussed the possibility of reviving the family business, a spark of excitement began to grow. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a common goal to work towards. Later that day, the family gathered in the small room where the clock was kept. Daniel had agreed to demonstrate how it worked, to help them all understand the burden he'd carried for 15 years. As they watched the clock's face shimmer and shift, showing glimpses of potential futures, each family member saw something different. Sarah saw herself smiling, truly happy for the first time in years. Michael saw the Posada thriving, filled with guests. Olivia saw herself surrounded by family, healthy and content. And Emily, her young eyes wide with wonder, saw it all, the good and the bad, the challenges and the triumphs. She understood in that moment that the future wasn't set in stone. It was a tapestry they were all weaving together, thread by thread, choice by choice. As the images faded, Daniel turned to his family. This is what I've learned, he said softly. The future isn't something to fear or run from. It's something we create every day with every decision we make. Sarah reached out, taking her father's hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. Then let's create it together, she said, her voice strong and clear. As they left the room, leaving the clock to its quiet ticking, there was a sense of something new beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But there was also hope. Hope that with time, understanding, and love, the wounds of the past could heal. The sun was setting over Milwaukee, casting a warm glow through the Posada's windows. In the kitchen, Daniel began to prepare dinner, the familiar rhythms of chopping and sautéing a comfort to him. One by one, his family joined him, Sarah setting the table, Michael uncorking a bottle of wine, Olivia sharing stories with Emily. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkward silence, of pain bubbling to the surface. But as they sat down to their first real family meal in 15 years, there was a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, time really could heal all wounds. As Emily looked around the table, seeing the tentative smiles and hearing the cautious laughter, she realized that this imperfect, complicated, loving family was the greatest magic of all. As weeks turned into months, the old Posada taste of home slowly came back to life. The process of reopening the family business became a metaphor for the family's own journey of healing and reconciliation. Each repaired floorboard, Each freshly painted wall seemed to mend a piece of their fractured past. Daniel, eager to make amends, threw himself into the restoration work. His expertise as a chef was invaluable as they updated the kitchen, and his knowledge of the building's quirks saved them time and money on repairs. Sarah, who had inherited her father's head for business, took charge of the financial aspects, working tirelessly to secure loans and permits. Michael, much to everyone's surprise, discovered a talent for interior design. He spent hours poring over color swatches and fabric samples, determined to give each room its own unique character while maintaining the Posada's homey charm. Olivia, though still recovering from her health scare, supervised it all from her favorite armchair in the lobby. Her sharp eye and wealth of experience ensured that the essence of Taste of Home remained intact, even as it was brought into the modern era. And Emily, ever curious and eager to help, became the family's unofficial photographer, documenting the transformation with her smartphone. Her Instagram account, A Taste of Home Rebirth, gained a modest following of locals excited to see the beloved Posada returning to its former glory. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted past the Posada's windows, the Carter family gathered in the newly refurbished dining room. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee. Daniel stood at the head of the table, a nervous energy radiating from him. "I have something to show you all," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. It's easier if I just show you." Curiosity piqued, the family followed Daniel up the stairs and down the hallway to the small room that housed the mysterious clock. As they entered, they gasped in unison. The room had been transformed. Gone were the cluttered workbenches and scattered papers. In their place stood sleek, modern equipment, computers, monitors, and strange devices that hummed with energy. At the center of it all, the old pendulum clock stood proudly, its brass fittings gleaming in the soft light. "What is all this, Dad?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Daniel took a deep breath. "I've been working on upgrading the clock, refining its abilities, making it more precise. And I've made a discovery that I think could change everything." He moved to the clock, adjusting a series of dials with practiced ease. The familiar glow began to emanate from its face, but this time it seemed brighter, more focused. "I've found a way to not just see potential futures, but to calculate probabilities," Daniel explained, his voice filled with awe. "We can now see not just what might happen, but how likely each outcome is." The family gathered around, watching as images flickered across the clock's face. They saw glimpses of the Posada bustling with guests, of family gatherings filled with laughter, of challenges overcome together. "But that's not all," Daniel continued. "I've also discovered something incredible about how our choices affect these probabilities." He pressed a button, and suddenly the images on the clock's face began to shift and change rapidly. It was as if they were watching 1,000 possible futures play out simultaneously. "Every decision we make, no matter how small, can have a profound impact on our future," Daniel explained. "Watch this." He reached out and moved a small object on a nearby table, a simple salt shaker. Instantly, the probabilities on the clock's display shifted, some futures becoming more likely, others fading into obscurity. The family stood in stunned silence, the implications of what they were seeing slowly sinking in. "Dad," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying we can use this to shape our future?" Daniel nodded solemnly. "To an extent, yes, but it's not about controlling the future. It's about understanding the power of our choices, the ripple effects of our actions." Sarah, always practical, spoke up. "But how does this help us? How can we use this without becoming paralyzed by the weight of every decision?" Daniel smiled, a hint of his old confidence returning. "That's the beauty of it, Sarah. We don't need to obsess over every little choice. The clock shows us that it's the big decisions, made with love and integrity, that truly shape our path." As the family discussed the implications of Daniel's discovery, Emily stood quietly, her young mind racing. Suddenly she spoke up, her voice clear and determined. "I think I understand," she said, drawing everyone's attention. "It's like in cooking, isn't it, Grandpa? You can follow a recipe exactly, but sometimes you need to trust your instincts to add a pinch of this or a dash of that. The recipe is like the probabilities, but the magic happens when you put your heart into it. Daniel looked at his granddaughter with pride and amazement. That's exactly right, Emily. You've understood something that took me years to figure out. As the significance of the moment washed over them, Olivia stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Daniel, she said softly, all those years ago, when you left, what exactly did you see that frightened you so much? Daniel's expression grew somber. I saw our family torn apart, Olivia. I saw financial ruin, betrayal, and your death.